All right, so let's continue talking about deductive versus inductive arguments. And in this lecture, and the next few, I'm going to focus a bit more on deductive arguments. We'll say a little bit about inductive, but our focus is going to be deductive. So, as I said last time, a deductive argument with a good structure is valid. Or I said, a deductive argument with a good structure, if the premises are true, the conclusions can't be false. The technical term for that is validity. Validity just means if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. What this means is you can't even imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false in a valid argument. If you can imagine a way that the premises might be true and the conclusion false, then the argument's not valid. You know, it might turn out that, well, the premises are true and the conclusion is true, but if you could imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion could be false, then it's not valid. We'll talk more about that in a second. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that validity is all or nothing. An argument is either valid or it's not. Look, I know in ordinary language, in ordinary conversation, you might say, well, this is a pretty valid argument, or this looks not to be a very valid argument. We use validity as just a shorthand a lot of times for saying, well, an argument's good or not, right? Philosophers and other people who work in logic use the term validity a bit more precisely. They use it to mean something a bit more specific. And what they use it to mean is, the premises can't be true and the conclusion false. And this is all or nothing. An argument's either valid or it's not. So, in this class, please don't speak about an argument being a little valid or not really all that valid, right? And the way we're going to use the term, which is not just me making up a term, the way that the term is used in logic, it has a very specific meaning. And an argument, it's all or nothing, valid or not. Now, another thing to keep in mind, and I think this will become clear when we look at some examples, but I just want to talk about this to start with, is that validity is about the structure of the argument, how the premises are supposed to support the conclusion if they are true. Validity is about the structure. It's not about the stuff the argument is built from, right? Look, think about architecture. Think about building a building. If you have a terrible plan, then I don't care how good your materials are, your house or your building or whatever is not going to be very stable, right? You can use the best building materials in the world, and if your plan's bad, this thing is going to fall down. Or at the very least, it's going to be very dangerous, right? In the same way, validity is about the plan of the argument. And, the stuff your argument's made of is premises, good and bad premises. They're good if they're true, they're bad if they're false. An argument can have all true or all very plausible premises, and if it's not valid, at least if it's a deductive argument, it's not a good argument. It's not going to establish its conclusion in the way it should. But, by the same token, if you have a really good plan for your building, but the person who builds it comes in and cuts corners and builds it out of complete junk, it's still not going to be stable. It's still not going to be safe, right? A valid argument has a good plan, but if the premises are bad, if they are just obviously false or they're really controversial and nobody accepts them, it's not going to be a good argument. The material matters. So, validity tells you only that the argument has, I put in scare quotes here, a good plan. But if we're speaking a bit metaphorically still, the materials might be bad, right? And what this talking about the materials might be bad means is that the premises might be obviously false at worst, or somewhat better but still bad. They might be really controversial premises most people don't accept. So arguments like that can be valid. They're still not good arguments. Another little bit of jargon, and this is not going to be one that I'm going to talk about a whole lot because we're mostly going to talk about validity. That's what interests me, the structure of the argument. But a bit of jargon you will see is people will talk about sound arguments. They'll sometimes use the term cogent argument to mean something very similar, slightly different, but you don't need to know that. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that. A sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. To have a good argument has to be, at least deductive arguments, it has to be both valid and it has to have true premises. The jargon people use for that is a sound argument. It's not going to be super important. We're not going to talk about that. It's a logic class. We talk more about the structure, the truth and falsity of the premises. Like I said, we say a little bit about that. It's kind of secondary for us. Anyway, here are some valid deductive arguments. All dogs are mammals. Moxie is a dog, so Moxie is a mammal. If it is in fact true that all dogs are mammals and Moxie is a dog, she has to be a mammal as well, right? And she in fact is. Usually she'd be sitting here staring at me as I do this, but I don't know, she's somewhere else. Anyway, she's a mammal, right? It is wrong for doctors to do anything that harms their patients. When doctors refuse to aid terminally ill patients who want to die, this harms them. So it is wrong for doctors to refuse terminally ill patients who want to die. Now look, I don't know that these premises are true, but, if they are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. I think this argument might not be a good one. I think it might have a false premise. I'm not sure that refusing to aid somebody harms them, but if we accept that, then the conclusion has to be true as well. Finally, a much longer deductive argument. Clearly the First Amendment's protections on speech cannot mean that the government cannot put any restrictions on speech. If it did, then it would be wrong for the government to restrict untrue speech that directly harms others, such as yelling fire in a crowded concert as a prank. The original way the Supreme Court Justice put this was fire in a crowded theater. This was turn of the century. People were in theaters. They were watching vaudeville shows and stuff like that. Concerts more modern, but you get the point, right? It definitely isn't wrong for the government to restrict untrue speech that harms others, like yelling fire in a crowded concert, right? If the government couldn't put any restrictions at all on speech, then the government couldn't say that we're going to pass a law that you can't do something that directly harms others. When you speak that's false, the government can pass laws like that. In fact, we think it should, right? So as you can hear, Moxie is making her presence known. Probably barking at the delivery man. She really wants to guard us against UPS, right? So here, some of those arguments were pretty controversial, especially the physician-assisted suicide one. But, just to make the point, let's look at a few valid deductive arguments with just obviously false premises, right? As I said, valid deductive arguments might not be good ones. They might not be sound. They might have false premises, right? Moxie is a dog. All dogs are reptiles. So Moxie is a reptile, right? It is not, in fact, the case that all dogs are reptiles. No dogs are reptiles. They're all mammals. But if these premises were true, which 2 is not, the conclusion would have to be true as well. A valid argument with false premises, good plan, garbage material, or to put it another way, valid but not sound, not a good argument. If strep throat is caused by a virus, then no medicine will treat it. Strep throat is caused by a virus, so no medicine will effectively treat it, right? Look, if these premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well, so it is a valid argument. But it's a bad argument. It's an unsound argument because both of the premises are untrue. As a matter of fact, there are some medicines that will treat some viruses, right? Tamiflu will treat the flu, for instance. It's not like a quick cure, but it will do something to treat the flu, right? I'm blanking. There's a whole bunch more. Antibiotics won't work against viruses. That doesn't mean that no virus will, right? No medicine will. Premise 1 is false. Premise 2, strep throat is caused by a virus, also false. Strep throat is caused by strep. I know, big surprise given the name, right? Which is a bacteria. If the premises were true, which neither of them is, the conclusion would have to be true as well. That's all validity means. Now contrast that with some invalid deductive arguments. All dogs are mammals. Moxie is a mammal, so she's a dog. Now look, as a matter of fact, all these premises, both of them are true, the conclusion's true, but it's invalid because you could imagine ways that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. All dogs are mammals. Okay, that's true. Moxie is a mammal, but cats are mammals, right? Hamsters are mammals. Pigs are mammals. Humans are mammals, right? She could be a mammal and be any of those things, right? I mean, Moxie would be a weird name for a human. I always say that one of these days I'm going to have a person who has a child named Moxie and they're going to be mad at me and it's going to get in my evaluations, but whatever. Moxie would be a weird name for a person. I stand by that. But nonetheless, she could be a person, right, and be a mammal. We can imagine all kinds of ways that these premises are true and the conclusion could be false. Doesn't matter that as a matter of fact the conclusion is true. What's important is we can imagine ways premises are true and the conclusion could be false. If she's a cat, the premises would be true and the conclusion false. If she's a person, premises would be true, conclusion false. If she's a hamster, premises true, conclusion false. Right? Imagine it says in the syllabus, you're taking a calculus class, and it says, look, any student who gets an A in all the exams will get an A in the course. Laura did not get an A in the course. Laura did not get an A on all the exams, so she won't get an A in the course. Well, this is a bad argument, right? The first premise just said, well, if you do get an A in all the exams, you get an A in the course. The premise never says that that's the only way to get an A in the course, right? Maybe there's like 2 exams and she has 100% on one and an 89 on the other and 100 on all her homework assignments. She would still get an A even though she missed the A on one exam by just a little bit, right? All the first premise says is if you do get an A on all the exams, you'll get an A in the course. It never says that that's the only way to get an A, right? It never says that if you don't get an A on all the exams, you won't get an A in the course. We can imagine all sorts of ways this premise is true and the conclusion's false, right? We can imagine, for all that we know, plenty of other ways she could get an A in the course, right? So, invalid deductive argument. Since we can imagine ways that the premises are true while the conclusion is false. Here's a final one. It is wrong to directly harm another person, but letting someone you could easily save by die by not helping does not directly harm that person, right? You know, and I think these premises are true, right? Look, harming somebody means you do something to them that makes them worse off, right? But if you just refuse to help somebody, you're not doing anything to them. You're just not helping, right? If somebody's drowning in shallow water and you stand there and watch it and you don't throw in a rope or a lifesaver, well, you're not doing anything to that person. They would have drowned if you weren't there, right? So I think these premises are true, but they don't justify the conclusion, right? All that the first premise says is it is wrong to directly harm a person. First premise never says that's the only thing it's wrong to do, right? First premise never says it's not wrong to refuse to help somebody, right? It could well be true that it is wrong to harm people and that not helping someone when you could do it easily isn't harming them, but still be false that it's perfectly okay to let people die when you could save them. And in fact, I think that's true, right? If you see a child drowning in shallow water and you don't save him, you haven't harmed him, right? You're not the one who pushed him in the water. He would have died had you not done that. But I think it's still very, very wrong to watch and let that happen, right? And nothing this argument says shows that that's not true. First premise never denies that it is wrong not to help somebody. It just says it's wrong not to harm someone. All right, so hopefully this is getting a little bit clearer to you guys what validity is, what an invalid deductive argument looks like. Now look, if you can think of a way the premises are true with the conclusion false, the argument, if you can think of a way the premises are true, conclusion false, the argument is invalid. That often takes a little bit of thought, a little bit of doing. Well, to save ourselves some effort, there are certain forms of argument that are valid that you can instantly recognize as valid. We'll talk about those. That makes our life a lot easier. That's why we will look at those forms of argument. You don't always have to sit there and try to think of ways that might be false. Valid forms of argument, knowing them will help you with that, and we will get to those. Final thing I will say is that no matter how good an inductive argument structure might be, it can't be valid. Why not? Well, with an inductive argument, remember, there's always some tiny, tiny chance that the premises are true and the conclusion's false. By definition, with an inductive argument, you can imagine a way that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. But look, it's important though, if a deductive argument is valid, then it's, the structure is good. If a deductive argument is invalid, then it's a bad deductive argument. But you should never judge inductive arguments by the standards you use to judge deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are never valid. By definition, they can't be. That does not mean they're bad arguments. They can still accomplish their goal, showing you that the conclusion is very likely to be true. Another way of putting this is that inductive arguments are always, and I'll put this in quotes, risky. Deductive arguments aren't risky. If the premises are true and the argument's valid, the conclusion has to be true as well. But no matter how good the form of an inductive argument might be, no matter how obviously true the premises might be, there's always some chance, sometimes really, 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 really small, but there, that the conclusion is false. Final thing I'll say, when talking about whether the structure of a deductive argument is good or not, just repeating this, it's all or nothing, valid or not. And you can represent this. Deductive arguments, because they're all or nothing, you can present this in a sort of 1 or 0 form, right? We'll talk about this with truth tables. You'll have T's and F's, but you can almost just put 1 as T and 0 as F, right? If you do computer programming of any sort or know anything about computers, you're probably having some ideas right now. And if you are, you're right to, right? And I'll talk more about that. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, come in degrees. That makes inductive arguments a lot harder to evaluate. Deductive arguments, you can just plug in your true or false. We'll talk more about that. Inductive arguments, if you ever get into them, you actually have to use some fractions. Some people hate that. It's a little bit harder for that reason. It's also harder just because there's matters of degrees, right? Not all or nothing in the same way deductive arguments are.